Okay, with the engine all cleaned up, what I'd love to do is pull the valve cover and then check the valve clearances. If they're all good, I'm going to slap it back on and we're going to put it in the frame. Let's get that plug out of there. I do need to get like a small 16mm socket, but for right now I've got this. But for now I've got this thin spark plug removal tool. It's a little bit too short to use the actual pole that goes through, so I'm just going to end up rotating this if I can. It's looking like a nice chocolatey brown mixture on there. I'll take these bolts out now. And see if we can get this cover off. It looks like there's a little RTV on the side, so it might fight us a bit. And there we go. Actually, wasn't that much on there. Looks like it was just holding the gasket on. Okay, now that we got the valve cover off, we need to set the engine to top dead center on the compression stroke. And pop this cover off here. So we can see our crank bolt, and then we can turn the engine over clockwise, and let's see if it's going to be easy to see here. Alright, so there's going to be a timing mark on this gear that aligns with that little triangle piece that hangs out off the case. Probably pretty hard to see that, but there's a tiny dot on that gear that aligns with that triangle piece coming off the case. On the other side of the engine, you can see that this mark on the cam gear is aligned with the little triangle that's behind it. Same with the bottom there. And we know we're on the compression stroke because all of our lobes are facing out. They're not making contact with the rockers or the buckets below. Okay, so the intake side, we want the valve clearance to be 0.16 millimeters plus or minus 0.03. So I've got a 0.15 here. And it does not fit on that side. That's just about perfect on this side. So let's go down to 0.13, see if we can get under there. Nope, still too tight. So we've got at least one valve that's too tight, which is this one here. Okay, so for our exhaust side, they should be 0.26 millimeters, so plus or minus 0.03, which is between 0.29 and 0.23. Start with 0.23 here. Fits on both sides. 0.28 here. Fits on both sides. Let's make sure we're not too big. So got a 0.3 here somewhere. 0.3, which also fits. So we have too much space on the exhaust. See if 0.35 fits. 0.35 is too big. 0.33, too big. Okay, so we're somewhere between a 0.3 and a 0.33. Still too big on the exhaust side. So I did confirm that this has a hot cam stage 2 cam in it, and the intake and exhaust tolerances are a little bit different. It's 0.25 for the exhaust and 0.15 for the intake. All right, so I got the engine ready to take the cam and carrier off. I've put 2 more reference points on here. I just like to have something on the chain so it's easier to get the sprocket back in the right location. Even though there are marks on the cam guide here and the cam itself. So I've gone ahead, grabbed a piece of paper. I love to just write down as much info as I can because doing this a whole bunch of times sucks. So I have the spec for the intake and the exhaust written here. I've got it oriented in the direction the engine's facing. We've got the measurements with the feeler gauges here. So this one's actually perfect. This is a little too tight and the exhaust is too loose. So we're gonna be changing out these 3 shims here. This engine has a manual cam chain tensioner, so I'm just going to pull this out, get some slack up in here, and then we're going to tackle the carrier. I got some slack in the chain here. I'm going to try and hold the cam gear here while I take the decompressor arm off. There we go. All right, so next up we're going to take these cam bolts out. So I'm holding onto the crank with this ratchet back here, and then we can hopefully pop these bolts out. Should be able to pop this gear off now. And let's find a piece of wire to hold the cam chain up. So we're going to pull off the carrier bolts here, and we're going to do a crisscross pattern and stage it out. I'm going to carefully lift this up. Try not to lose any shims. Oh, just like that. That was this shim right here. Shim still in the bucket there. And so I'm lining them up on my piece of paper so I know exactly where they came from, and I'll measure them in just a sec here. Magnets are super useful for getting them out without dropping them into the crankcase. Now that we got the shims out, we can go ahead and measure them, see what their thickness is. I've just got a pair of digital calipers here. They're like 2.17, 2.15, 2.16. I'm going to go with 2.15 here. I'm just rotating the shims between the jaws just to try and get an average of what it is across. And none of this is super accurate, but it's enough to give us an idea where to start. I'm going to go with 1.9. And then our really tight intake is, let's call this 2. Forgot to write on here, this is going to be plus or minus 0.03, which is important because now we got to figure out what size shim to replace this with so we get within the spec. And essentially, if this is a 2 and we need to open this gap up to a 0.15, I'm going to need to reduce this shim size by about 0.08 so that we get something like this, where if we're 0.07, then we are 0.08 0.08 away from the 0.15, and then we still have the plus or minus 3. So this 0.08 has to come from this shim size. So we're going to try and find something that's like a 1.92, but they don't come in that granular of shim sizes. So what we'll probably end up with is a 1.90. Got my hot cams shim kit here. I buy the kit because I go through so many bikes that it just kind of makes sense, and then I'll refill the shims as I go through them. But here we can see they're in 0.05 millimeter increments. So if we grab a 0.90 here, we can rest that next to the shim that we're trying to swap out. Let's move that over here. So we're going to put a where's my pen? So we're putting in a 1.90, which should get us a overall gap of that's 15, 0.17, which is within spec there. Now we just do that for these two here and throw them in the engine. Okay, so we have our unchanged shim here, which was within spec. Our new 1.9 millimeter that should open up this intake. The buckets on here. And I've got the 2.2, which should close up our exhaust a little bit on each of these. 2.2. Perfect. Make sure they're sitting nice and flat. There's nothing underneath them. And we can bring our cam carrier back on here. Lift these guys up. That did not just go down there. Thought it would be easy to put the cam guide on there with the buckets in place. Well, got stuck, and as I pulled it out, one of the shims fell down, went down the cam chain, and ended up right here. Luckily, I was planning on doing an oil change anyway, so not a big deal, but kind of a pain if you were doing this without needing to get in here. Okay, let's try that again. I got a new filter in here, and I got the cover reinstalled. This time I'm going to be putting the buckets into the carrier first before sitting it on top of the valves. Okay, let's get the shims back on there and then we'll set the carrier on. Okay, that was much easier with the buckets in the carrier. I don't know why I didn't do that from the get-go. Alright, we're just going to snug these up before we torque them. Alright, these are 10 foot-pounds for torque, and we're going to start at 8 and then go to 10 after that. That's 8. That's 10. So to get the sprocket back onto the cam, we align this little mark with this mark here. That puts us back at the right timing. Get our sprocket. That's sitting there nicely. Line that up. Pop in our bolts. I'm going to pretend that I'm confident in my measurements, and I'm going to put thread locker on these, and hopefully I don't have to take them back off. Not a big deal, but it'll save me an extra step of having to pull these off after checking the new tolerances. All right, once again, holding the crank back here so that I can put a little bit of torque on these. That's 15. Get our decompression lever in there. Gonna install our cam chain tensioner again. All right, with that all reinstalled and our tensioner on, nice and tight here, I'm gonna spin the engine over a few times and then we'll recheck the gaps for the valves. Okay, we spun it over twice. It's back at top dead center. Here's a 0.25. Yeah, that's like money with the 0.25 there. Just barely dragging on both of those. So definitely within spec. Let's recheck our valve that we didn't adjust. Make sure it's still, yep, that is still a nice firm drag on 0.15. We're looking for 0.17 on this one. I'm going to start with 0.15. Ooh. Ruh-roh. Well, everything measured out great except for this valve again. So this valve is still tight, which is interesting because it feels even tighter than it was before. So maybe the shim bucked a little bit when I was putting this carrier on. Either way, got to strip it all back and get down to what's going on there. So be back in a sec when that's all done. All right, I had to disassemble this and check the shims a couple times. One, the shim back here on the valve that was tight had actually come out of the bucket and was sitting on top, so that was what was causing it to be so tight. So I also threw in a 1.85 instead of the 1.90, and that loosened it up a little bit too. So this came in at 0.17 millimeters for the gap. This is 0.15. These are 0.25 and 0.26 respectively. So all within spec now. Reapplied Loctite here, freed this up to make sure that this is spinning. I guess once you tighten this down, just give this a little flick and it'll free up. It was binding as this was getting tightened, but as soon as I flicked it, it's all free up. Just gotta throw the valve cover and a new spark plug in, and I think just a little bit of oil. We can toss this in the bike. I don't know when I stopped recording, but I put the seal on and then I torqued these to 7 foot-pounds. It actually felt pretty sketchy because of the rubber here and the rubber here compressing, that these just kept turning. But man, does this look good or what? Like, all nice and shined up. One of these days I'll do the whole engine. I got races to go to though. Picked up a thin wall spark plug socket off of Amazon, so that way I don't have to use that janky thin wall to get in there. And then a new spark plug. So let's get that in there. Lower that in with a magnet. Doesn't quite So I'm pretty stoked to have the engine all tiled in. We got the valves adjusted, got it all cleaned up. I'm gonna pull off this vent hose, and I've got new lines coming for that, but we'll run those in the bike so we know where our catch can is gonna be. And yeah, so let's get this thing slapped into the bike on the next one. So thanks for hanging out with me in the garage, and I'll see you later.